In an earlier discussion, we had introduced the concept of Sanskritization, suggesting that some caste groups placed at the relatively lower level of caste hierarchy began to claim superior ritual status by following the upper caste behavioral codes, by accepting that taboos that the upper caste actually practiced, even though they might not have followed these upper caste behavioral norms in earlier times. Some sociologists like M.N. Srinivas label this as Sanskritization.
Sir, what do you mean by this term Sanskritization in sociological terms?
This is actually suggestive of the emulation of Brahminical norms relating to private behavior or public postures. For example, widow remarriage might have been a fairly widespread practice at the lower levels of caste hierarchy among the not so Brahminized or sections of the population. So these people would actually ask their fellows to practice prohibition against widow remarriage, temperance, for example. So there can be many ways through which the lower caste population is encouraged to follow the upper caste behavioral norms.
Sir, who were these people and from which class did they come?
Usually, we find that such initiatives towards Sanskritization come from relatively affluent sections among the lower caste, a kind of a caste elite. People who might have made some money from expansion of agriculture or from commerce, and on the strength of a slightly better or improved material position, they develop these aspirations to become more respectable within the ritual hierarchy. Now, alongside Sanskritization, the other avenue for social mobility that historians actually talk about come from the opportunities that are created by the new educational system. Sanskritization was a traditional method. It had been continuing in Indian society for a long stretch of time. Take, for example, the Rajput question. Peasants, once they formed their own independent power centers, acquired aspirations, the kind of royal connotation that the term Rajput actually implies. Not all of these people were Rajputs. You will come across a time when many of these groups in local communities began to claim Rajput status. It is not possible that these people had migrated from Rajasthan and settled down over time in all these regions. Many people came from within these indigenous communities, became powerful locally, carved out their little kingdoms and claimed Rajput status. This is Khatriyization of a certain kind. And aspirations for Kshatriya status or Khatriyization continued even through the 19th century. So, Sanskritization has many implications. And claiming ritual status on the basis of certain traditional behavioral norms also involved a certain degree of revivalism as well, because invariably many of these caste groups actually would visualize a fairly respectable position of theirs in the past, which they sought to restore. At times, it goes against the Brahminical orthodoxy. At times, it conforms to it, depending on situations, depending on the kind of leadership that these different caste groups would actually possess. If we consider, for example, the cow protection movement in northern India, this is linked with Sanskritization process. Intermediate caste groups, Queries, Kurmis, Jadavs, who had become materially quite powerful, were beginning to adopt this cow protectionism in order to claim a certain kind of affinity with the custodians of the Brahminical social order, in which, as you know, cow figures as a venerable object. Gyanendra Pandey's work on cow protectionism has drawn attention to this aspect of cow protectionism, apart from the other issues raised by Dayananda Saraswati's followers. But we were actually touching on the other avenues of social mobility, which can act as a foundation for mobility at one level and then encourage people to claim superior ritual status. The British rule came with a certain opportunity for the low caste people. Christianity, for example, provided many of these low caste groups with the possibility of an escape from a social order dominated by Brahminical orthodoxy. Within this matrix, we have to locate the happenings in different regions. One cannot simply provide a comprehensive framework because Indian society in any case had very strong regional features which one ought to consider in order to get the sense of how caste mobility movement used Sanskritization variedly in their aspirations for mobility. Let us take, for example, the case of Bengal. We have a community in southern part of Bengal concentrated in districts like Midnapur or southwest Bengal, Mahishyas. There was an ongoing Mahishya movement in the 19th century whereby this peasant caste, sections of which became very materially wealthy, started claiming Kshatriya status, claiming that they were offsprings of Kshatriya rulers. Similar aspirations for superior caste status within the Varna system, claiming Kshatriya status, were seen among the Rajvanshis in northern Bengal. Something which sociologists describe as the Kshatriya movement. It was not limited to Bengal alone. You may come across similar tendencies in other parts of the country as well. So, this was one aspect of caste mobility which was linked with Sanskritization. But you have also in Bengal, roughly around this time, a different kind of movement on which Shekhar Bandyopadhyay, the noted social historian, has written extensively. It's the movement among the Namashudra peasants in eastern Bengal, belonging to the very low strata in the caste hierarchy. It was a peasant caste, unlike the Mahishyas who could be admitted into the Brahmin households. The Namashudras were actually debarred from entering into Brahmin households, and with them the Brahmins had no physical connection or touch. The whole thing is determined by the purity pollution criterion. Some people are so impure that the Brahmins were going to be contaminated by this impurity by their touch. You will certainly come across this kind of caste prejudice in a very horrendous, oppressive form in southern India, where the very sight of a Pulaya or a Zava was polluting for the Brahmins. These Namashudras actually became organized into a powerful movement, mainly in the eastern districts of Bengal. And one of the main catalysts to their mobilization, apart from the political significance that the Namashudra movement began to acquire from the turn of the century, was a sort of a Protestant sect in the region called the Matua Sect. The Matuas have certainly come to very great prominence in recent times as important political actors. But if you go trace the origin of this movement in the late 19th century, under the aegis of some of the important leaders of the Namashudra community at that time, we see how this movement had inherited some of the Protestant elements in Vaishnavism. Vaishnavism in Bengal became divided into two different persuasions. One was Gauriya Vaishnavism, which was more orthodox, which, despite their criticism of the caste system, ultimately failed to break it. And then you have the popular Vaishnavas, which actually took positions against the caste system. Matuas inherited this tradition and organized a movement in eastern Bengal. They looked upon two gurus as their preceptors, Guru Chand and Hari Chand, and tried to avoid all the ritualistic paraphernalia that goes along with Brahminical religious culture. One of the main precepts that the Matua protagonist proclaimed is that you have the word of God in your lips and work in your hands, a kind of a Puritan ethics, that you have to be very careful about your mundane responsibilities. You have to maintain your families, you have to respect family values, and at the same time you have the words of God in your lip. That is where you can see a movement actually breaking the limitation of Sanskritization and acquiring a more Protestant dimension, a more radical dimension, where the Brahminical orthodoxy was not merely challenged but was sought to be subverted. It was not as if that they were adopting Brahminical rituals in order to be accommodated within the system, but there were tendencies whereby they actually put up a major challenge against orthodoxy itself, against the ritualisms of the Brahminical religious culture itself. So there are certainly stages when the limitation of Sanskritization is overcome by many of these caste movements to produce more socially radical tendencies. But it is not as if that when such transcendence takes place, when some movements begin to acquire these radical tendencies, they become completely unhinged from their Sanskritizing aspirations. Even among the Namashudras, we come across certain inclination on their part to adopt the behavioral norms of the upper caste. The Namashudras ask their women not to go to the fields, not to serve in other households. So that is the way upper caste behavioral norm remained important for many of these upwardly mobile Namashudra families, some of whom actually were beginning to take advantage of Western education and becoming urban professionals. So, in any case, whether you are talking about the Mahishas in Bengal or the Namashudra movement in Bengal, it is easy to identify a certain creamy layer, a certain elite section among these caste groups who would be materially solvent enough, materially powerful enough to be able to challenge the domination of the Brahmins, at times by following their behavioral norms, at times trying to break the limitations of Sanskritization. But you see the real implications of these tendencies not in Bengal, where caste certainly existed, but where you have very powerful intermediary caste groups. They existed as buffers between Brahminical order and the lower orders of people. In those regions where these buffers didn't exist, where you do not come across powerful groups in the middle layer of the caste hierarchy, the protest movements became also more forthright, more articulate, and more virulent against the Brahminical social ideology. And something, yes.
Sir, what was the nature of this radical movement?
Partly I have answered this question by talking about the Matua Sect, that even though sections of the Namashudra movement would actually be happy by adopting upper class behavioral norms, the Matuas came up with a radical ideology. Not merely by trying to find a space within the system, but actually defying it. Certainly their inspiration came from Vaishnava thought, but it had great radical potentialities. And such radicalization we will come across in other parts of the country more prominently. So, if we shift our focus from Bengal and to Western India and to Southern India, we can see the implications of the statement more clearly. Maharashtra, as you know, was a land of Brahminical orthodoxy. You go through B.R. Ambedkar's memoirs, you come across the kind of anguish that this man was expressing about his childhood experience of being persecuted by the forces of orthodoxy. If you go further down towards Kerala and try to make an assessment of the way the Ezhava movement was organized, or to the condition of the Nadars, you see similar oppressive features of Brahminical orthodoxy. And in the case of Travancore, this orthodoxy was in fact supported by the rulers of the Prince of Travancore.
Sir, who were the Nadars and how did they get involved in the caste mobility movement?
These Nadars were actually toddy tappers. They were known as shunners, but then a section, once they became somewhat wealthy through participation in commerce, they wished to be known as Nadars. And over time, they started a movement to gain respectability. Ultimately, it linked up with respectability movement, self-respect movement of Ramaswamy Naikar. But that's a different story. Since we are concentrating mainly on the 19th century and the caste mobility movements in which Sanskritizing ideas were important, we are not getting into the implications of these movements on political life in India. But to return to the point that we are making about some movements capable of transcending the barriers and becoming more radical, we can look at Maharashtra, the movement that was initiated by Jyotirao Phule. Maharashtra was a region of great orthodoxy. And Jyotirao Phule, as the research of Rosalind O'Hanlon in recent times has revealed, came from the Mali community. People who were untouchables, but who were becoming prosperous over time. He got education, and this education became a major incentive for him to claim a higher status for his community. He wrote a book in 1870 called Gulamgiri, and the following year in 1873, he established the Shattashadak Samaj. Now, obviously, the idea was to become more respectable. But in order to establish their rights, as O'Hanlon shows in her work, Jyotirao Phule was actually traveling back to history, arguing that they were the Adi Khatriyas of the region, the old warrior castes who had once enjoyed a respectable position in the society, who had a perfect harmonious relationship with groups whom the invading Aryans convert into Shudras. So the idea that they were the Adi Khatriyas and their preeminence in local society, which came to be destroyed by the Aryans, by the invading Brahmins, is itself a certain kind of revivalism. And also, one can consider this as an aspect of Sanskritization. Now, this movement ultimately produced more radical tendencies. The non-Brahman movement in Maharashtra split into two distinct tendencies. One was the kind of aspiration that you come across in Shattashadak Samaj, where by claiming a superior status in the past, some people were trying to rise up in the social hierarchy, in the ritual hierarchy. The other was a more radical tendency, where there was kind of popular radicalism which became an attack on the caste system itself. Subsequently, some of these men who participated in this kind of a social movement against casteism became linked with the Congress. And this was the larger context of B.R. Ambedkar's emergence as the leader of the oppressed and depressed social groups. We come across similar movements among the Mahars as well. So, it is very easy to see in the context of Maharashtra how a movement which had once been started to find some accommodation within the hierarchy by claiming Kshatriya status ultimately managed to cross this barrier and becoming a more strident denunciation of caste ideology, where the protagonist of a more radical position would claim or would actually voice the grievances of what they described as the Bahujan Samaj. If you go further down to South India, you see it as prominently as you see in Maharashtra. Similar patterns were visible in Madras Presidency, where you see some intermediate powerful groups like the Nayars, the Vellalas, the Kammas, who were powerful for reasons of material prosperity, who were English educated. They were intermediary groups who claimed superior status. But below them existed the untouchable communities. We are talking about the Nayars, and these Nayars in the 18th century became exposed to Christianity. Some of them became Christians. Others, following the usual model of Sanskritization, claimed Kshatriya status, demanded the right of temple entry, wished to change the dress code, the very debilitating dress code that had been inflicted on them, try to gain self-respect, in other words. Now, if you go to Kerala and talk about the Vezavas, the Ezava community, once again Tory tappers, they were participating in the choir industry by that time. It was a flourishing choir industry. Some of these Ezavas became quite prosperous. They earned money by participating in choir trade, and they got into these new institutions of learning. So just like among the Nadars you see an elite, also among the Ezavas, an Ezava elite was capable of challenging the forces of orthodoxy by claiming a superior status. And such claims came to be sustained by a certain degree of material prosperity that the Ezava elite had acquired through their participation in new professions, through their participation in new educational system, through the manner in which some of these elites would be practicing medicine by attending Ayurvedic lessons in Sanskrit schools. So, they started a major movement under a man called Narayan Guru. And one of the main thrusts of the movement that Narayan Guru organized was to challenge the Brahminical order by adopting their ritual codes for the Ezava community. One of the ways to question the domination of the orthodoxy was to create their own institutions. They set up their own temples where the Ezava priests were actually serving the Ezava community. The Ezavas were not allowed to enter the Shiva temples maintained by the Brahmin priests, so they set up their own Shiva temples in which they got Ezava priests to administer the spiritual needs of the fellow members of the Ezava community. So up to a point, the movement that was initiated by Narayan Guru operated within what can be labeled as Sanskritization. But by the turn of the century, we see a greater degree of radicalism once again. There were attempts to cross that limit, but by the close of the century, we see the emergence of a solid organization called SNDP Jogam, and a very prominent Malayali poet, Kumaran Hasan, became involved in it. A Ayurvedic practitioner called Paplu became associated with it. And under their leadership, the SNDP Jogam, which was set up by Narayan Guru movement, began to move in a different direction to a point where it became a kind of a heresy. they questioned caste. They began to adopt more radical ideas. They, in fact, started using the language of atheism. If you go through Nambudripad's autobiography, you would come across how Nambudripad was recalling the kind of impact that this movement had made on him. He thought that this was a kind of cultural revolution that the Narayan Guru movement had been successfully brought about in Travancore and the adjoining regions in Kerala. So this is once again another instance of how the narrow confines of Sanskritization was ultimately broken and a far more comprehensive challenge against casteism, against orthodoxy was mounted. So this has been the experience of many of these movements, and if you stitch them together, you get an idea of how Sanskritization, along with Westernization, along with opportunities that the low caste groups came to receive for upward mobility from the new education, alongside all this, you have this other tendency of radicalization, where the burden of history was for the moment forgotten and the future was defined in somewhat different and perhaps more socially radical terms.